Okay, everyone. So our next step is to do this reasoning structure. And we're going to go back and look at our thesis statement, but you can also use this throughout your paper. So you're going to have your own copy to fill in here. It's basically a worksheet. So you get your own copy and you can write right on it. Okay. So I'm going to actually make a copy of this so that I don't mess up the master. So let me make a copy. That obviously you don't need to do this, but I'm just making a copy of a copy so I don't mess up the master here when I fill this out. All right. So I'm going to give you some notes and then you're going to fill this in. Basically, what you're going to write is in these boxes. Okay. So you guys should follow along on your in Canvas on this document, and I'll try to make it bigger so it's easier to see. Most of what I've already written in it, so I'm really not going to be doing any writing on here, so you can read on your screens. If I do add anything, I'll make sure and call your attention to it. Okay, so when we think about reasoning, there's basically three types of reasoning structures, and this isn't it. It's not meant to be super complicated, but it can be complicated. When next semester in critical thinking, we're going to delve into this more deeply. But let's think about an example, and it might help for you to do this as well, like on a piece of scratch paper as we go through this. Let's think about an example of an argument that you might make, right? So a classic argument made by many a junior throughout history has been arguing with parents for a later curfew. If anyone can relate to that, just give me a nod or a thumbs up or whatever, okay? So when I used to teach sophomores, a lot of it was about driving. But I feel like with juniors, arguing for a later curfew is probably more on point. Okay, so what you need to know is that the simplest and most straightforward way to structure reasoning is what's called side-by-side reasoning, okay? Side-by-side reasoning is when you list reasons and those reasons don't necessarily relate to each other. It's just a list, okay? So one of those reasons could even be disproven or maybe like not so strong, and you could still accomplish the goal of your thesis. Okay, so for instance, a good example of this might be a court of law where maybe the prosecutor brings in a mountain of evidence for why someone's guilty, and they're not related. It's just like a whole bunch of different pieces of evidence. And maybe the defendant, the defense attorney gets like 2 or 3 of those pieces of evidence thrown out for various reasons, but there's still a mountain of evidence to prove that the person's guilty. And so the prosecutor wins the trial, right? So a really simple version of this could be because I'm a straight A student. So that's your first reason, because of R1. R2, reason 2 would be I have never gotten in trouble when going out with friends. R3 would be, and I always tell the truth about what I'm doing. My curfew should be 1 in the morning. Now, what's interesting about this is that maybe I always tell the truth about what I'm doing isn't necessarily the best reason. Maybe we can poke holes in that, right? No, I think probably nobody has made it their entire life by being 100% truthful all the time. But just because of the way that's structured as a list, it doesn't really matter that that one might be a little bit weak. The overall sort of thrust of the argument is that there's basically at least three good reasons why the curfew should be extended to 1 in the morning. So because of reason 1, reason 2, and reason 3, therefore, right? And then you have your conclusion. Okay. So that's probably the one that you're going to want to use for your thesis statement for your paper. And oftentimes you do this last because you want to make sure that the things you list are actually what you have in your body paragraphs. So if you say it in your thesis, it needs to be in your essay. So it makes sense to go back and kind of retool your thesis after you've written your body paragraphs. So you might be thinking right now of structuring your thesis for your paper, like because of this and this and this, therefore, right? Now, remember, you want to make a statement about the essay in your thesis. So because of its depiction of, stereotypes that low wage workers go through, and its questioning of expectations and gender norms involving work, and its ability to humanize the very diverse types of people who do work in these jobs, working at Wendy's provides a contemporary argument for the meaning and the value of low wage work in this society, right? Because of this and this and this, therefore this, right? So it's just a list of reasons. Each one of those reasons is something that you're going to talk about in a body paragraph. So what you could do is, in this box, you're going to fill this in for your thesis. What might be helpful is, before you do that, you might want to make an example like the one that I have here on a piece of scratch paper about something, it could be maybe an argument you're going to have with your coach, like, because I always hit the threes, because I work hard on defense, and because I got that Grizzly spirit, I should be the starter, right? Like, it's just whatever it, just come up with a list of reasons. And again, the thing about side-by-side reasoning is that the reasons don't have to relate. They don't have to be dependent on each other. It's just a list of reasons, okay? So sometimes in writing classes, your teachers will have you do what's called a 3-point thesis, where you say literally because of, and you list 3 things, and then you make your claim. And then each body paragraph is proving one of those 3 things or exploring one of those 3 things. That's a pretty good model, and it could be pretty helpful. Although it's a little bit limited because it doesn't always work for everything. So I wouldn't want you to think that's the only way to do it, but it can be really helpful, especially when you're doing argument. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and explain the other 2 reasoning structures, and then I'm going to go back and give you time to fill this out. If you're working at home and you're watching this on video, feel free to pause and work on side by side now. Or you can watch through the video and come back. Okay, so the next type of reasoning structure is what's called joint reasoning. If you think about joint reasoning, it's sort of like how when you do like woodworking, where you have like you're building a floor or you're putting a floor down, they have like joints between the boards so that they fit together, or grooves. That's kind of how this reasoning structure works. Okay, so what joint reasoning is, it's when the reasons are not independent of each other. In this sort of model, a reason exists dependent on an additional reason. And all of these together seek to prove the conclusion. So because they're dependent on each other, if one of the ones in the list is false, then the whole thing kind of falls apart. If, so one example could be, if this is true and this is true and this is true, then the conclusion must be true. And this one can be pretty complicated and difficult, and we'll actually look at examples of this in critical thinking, where you go and you look at little arguments and break it down. But for right now, I want to give you a simple version of it. Because I'm honest with you, I always make good decisions and I will never let you down. My curfew should be 2 in the morning. Okay, maybe it's not quite as good of an argument as the last one because these are really like sort of overarching claims, right? And we might suggest that if somebody is dishonest, then the other things that they're saying aren't necessarily likely to be true. So if somebody is not honest, they probably don't always make good decisions. And we can't bank on the fact that they'll never let you down. So when they say that because of these things, my curfew should be 2, it kind of falls apart. But if they're honest and they make good decisions and they never let people down, that's a pretty great argument to make to your parents. So this one is really the same as this one. The only difference is that you can't basically disprove one of these and the thesis still holds. So this is a lot more elaborate form of argument, and it too is used in a court of law. And this would be a much harder thing to prove, right? Like, you could think of it as like maybe you had some video evidence of like a hit and run, right? And you could say that because the defendant was driving a 1979 blue Ford Mustang, and there was a blue Ford Mustang that ran the stop sign, and the blue Ford Mustang that ran the stop sign crashed into the side of the Studebaker, the defendant is guilty, right? So if you pull these things out, it doesn't work. If you say that he wasn't driving a Ford Mustang, well, your argument falls apart. If he didn't run the stop sign, the argument falls apart. And if it didn't crash into a Studebaker, the argument falls apart. So this one may not work as well for this essay, but it might work in some of your analysis. So I wanted to show it to you. And this is kind of a nice little challenge for you to think of writing a thesis where the ideas or the reasons are all dependent on each other in some way. And then the final type of reasoning is called chain reasoning. And basically what chain reasoning is where a reason becomes a conclusion. I'm sorry, where you reason to a conclusion, and that conclusion becomes a reason for a further conclusion. So in the example that I just gave here, I said, because the defendant was driving a 1979 sky blue Ford Mustang and was seen in the neighborhood, right? And then a 1979 sky blue Ford Mustang blows the stop sign in said neighborhood, and a 1972 Ford Mustang sideswipes the Studebaker. Therefore, the defendant is guilty. Okay. Now, if you could prove that there was 2 1979 or whatever year I said it was sky blue Ford Mustangs, the whole thing falls apart. But there are many ways to corroborate that. Like maybe they have a partial on the license plate and there's no other Ford Mustangs with that license plate in the state, so they can therefore prove that that's the defendant is guilty. So if you think about it this way, you would say the defendant was driving a 1972 sky blue Ford Mustang with license plate number XJ73P. And license plate or that car sideswiped the Studebaker. Because license plate XJ whatever 3P sideswiped the Studebaker, therefore the defendant is guilty, right? So the conclusion that this car with this license plate went through the stop sign becomes the reason for the further conclusion that they did it and there's no way out of it. So another example could be, because I get straight A's, I can be trusted to follow through on my responsibilities, right? So because I get straight A's, so that's a reason. Therefore, I can be trusted to follow through on my responsibilities. That's a conclusion, okay? Because, so reason one leads to a conclusion. Where the conclusion then becomes reason two. So because I get straight A's, I can be trusted to follow through on my responsibilities. And since I always follow through on my responsibilities, I will get home on time. So basically, this is an example for this is an outline for the above example, right? So, but you see how because I get straight A's is a reason? Because I get straight A's, I can be trusted to follow through on my responsibilities. That's the conclusion, right? And then you see how because since I always follow through on my responsibilities, I will get home on time. The conclusion then becomes a reason for the next statement that you're making. And because of all of that, my curfew should be 3. So this is called chain reasoning. So where you basically make a statement that supports a conclusion, and then that conclusion becomes a reason and a further set of statements to prove something. Again, that can get really complicated, and it may not be the best way to do it, but oftentimes we do give reasons that are somewhat dependent on each other or that support further conclusions. So, what we call this here, we call it an intermediate conclusion. So this conclusion that I can be trusted to follow through on my responsibilities isn't the final conclusion, right? But it's used to support the statements going forward till you get to the final conclusion, which is that the curfew should be 3 in the morning. So basically, to review, you have 3 kinds of reasoning. You have the kind where you list 3 reasons and they're totally independent and on their own. You have the kind where you list the reasons and they are totally dependent on each other in the sense that if one of them is wrong, the whole thing kind of falls apart. And you have the kind where you list a reason to support a conclusion, and then that conclusion becomes a reason for a further conclusion that supports your overall statement. Like I said, I think for this essay, for your thesis, the one where you just list your 3 reasons is a great place to start. But this is an honors class and you guys are the best and the brightest. So I wanted to show you these other types of reasoning structures so that you could practice thinking about them. So you obviously knew what was out there. And so you maybe want to use them in your analysis, right? Because you might be making if-then statements in your analysis, right? If somebody does this, right, this is the outcome. Or, when institutions steal credit from people of color, it supports a certain, racist power structure, right? So I know some of you are writing about Henrietta Lacks, right? So, these are types of statements you can make in your analysis as well. But anyways, what we're doing right now is you're actually going to create your thesis 3 ways and then pick the one that you like the best. Again, this is probably the most doable, the simplest, and the easiest to start with. And we're going to go from there. Also, the 3 reasons that you pick are going to be the 3 things that you cover in your body paragraphs in that order, okay? So this is also nice because you can change around the order. Maybe you want to take your 3rd reason and make it first. Well, that's fine because it's a list and they're not dependent on each other. It's a lot harder to change around the order when they're dependent on each other. The other thing about this is we haven't started writing the 3rd body paragraph yet, but if you list out your reasons, then that should give you at least the topic and what you're going to seek to prove in or explore in your body paragraph 3. So let's go ahead and try to fill this out, and then I'll take any questions. And then once we do that, I'm going to give you time to start working on revising what you have so far with this in mind, and then also starting to pull ideas, evidence, etc. for your 3rd body paragraph. Good luck. So this is what's due today, and then tomorrow we're going to be spending the period covering just a review of T-Bear for the 3 body paragraphs, and then I'm going to look at your 3 body paragraphs over the weekend. I don't necessarily think your 3rd one's going to be perfect, but in order to be really caught up and ready to go for class tomorrow, you do need to have your evidence pulled for your 3rd body paragraph and the reason or the thing from the thesis that you seek to talk about in it, because then you'll be able to write and develop it as you go. Okay, so for class tomorrow, you need to have that evidence, that quoted passage, and understand what part of the thesis that paragraph corresponds to, and so you'll be able to do T-Bear for it. This is due today. So you're filling in the areas here in the text boxes.